Labą dieną, kolegos. Dear colleagues, we have the second section. It's called the development of printing in Europe. In Europe, it will be in minor conference hall. First presentation is Associate Professor Dr. Benito Ria Costas from Complutense University of Madrid, Spain. His topic is presentation is printing revolution systems, expectations and structures. Because about this speech will be. Ne pagal eilę, bet kviestume tada profesorių daktarą Axel Ernst Walterį pristatyti savo pranešimo, jeigu Walteris galėtų šiuo metu. Dabar reikėtų mums jam parašyti arba paklausti per chatą, ar jis šiuo metu yra pasiruošęs, ar dar yra. Ar galėtume mes dabar jį pakalbinti, kaip yra profesoriaus galimybės.
I can hear you, but can you hear me?
Okay, Axel, if you have...
Well, I can't start any video. I just can hear you, but I'm not sure if you can hear me.
We hear you.
Okay.
Presentation you will have, Axel?
No,
without presentation.
Yeah.
Please introduce you. Professor Dr. Axel Ernst Walter is from Vilnius University, and also he works in Research Center for Travel Culture Eutin in Germany. He is our professor from our faculty. His speech will be about book printing scholars of the Renaissance, and I'm glad to hear his speech. Please, Axel.
Okay, so if you can hear me, dear colleagues, thank you for inviting me, and I have to apologize not to be there in Vilnius, but today I'm having a very important meeting with our council at 5 o'clock, and I cannot miss it. So my short presentation is about learned printers of Renaissance. With the innovation of book printing, a new profession arose, which is still practiced today between craftsmanship and art, between business and passion, between mass production and individual pieces. From the very beginning, different types of printers, which were working often also as publishers, were active, differing in their ancestry and social position, their educational background and their ambitions, skills, convictions, and in their innovative and intellectual potential. Some of these early printers are famous to our days, others, most of them, are forgotten. This short presentation wants to introduce briefly some of them in a comparative biographical approach in order to be able to emphasize the extraordinary place of the first printer on Lithuanian soil in the history of Renaissance. One name that probably comes up first is that of Aldus Manutius, who studied ancient languages and literatures in Ferrara, Rome, and Verona, and who set up his printing house in Venice in 1489. Manutius embodies the type of humanistic scholar who not only turned the trade of printing into typographic art, but also appeared as author and editor of editions and textbooks. Humanism and book printing were also combined in the work of Johann Ammerbach, who had earned his master's degree at the Sorbonne in Paris and had been successful as a book printer and publisher in Basel since 1477. Like Manutius, he surrounded himself with a circle of local scholars who, as editors or authors shaped the humanistic profile of his printing house. William Caxton had most likely also studied, but he had lived as a cloth merchant in Bruges since the 40s and only learned the printer's trade in Cologne in 4071-72, when he was around 50 years old. In 4076, he founded the first English printing house in Westminster. Unlike Manutius or Ammerbach, the Latin or Greek literature did not determine his production. Rather, 74 of a total of 107 prints were published in English, which at least 20 of those books being translated into English by Caxton himself. Anton Koberger, another name, on the other hand, brought capitalism into the trade, into the young trade. The Nuremberg citizen temporarily employed around 100 journeymen on allegedly 24 presses in his printing company, which had been founded in 1470. He maintained various branches in Europe. Johann Froben had learned from him, among others. Froben, who had little knowledge of Latin and no higher education, took over Ammerbach's printing workshop and paid attention to the quality of his products. His son, Hieronymus, and his grandson, Ambrosius Froben, continued the printing business in Bale until 1487. After it was sold, the Hyers continued printing until 1595. Koberger's printing empire fell apart 13 years after his death. Johann Froben founded a local printing dynasty that lasted around a century. This development can be observed in some places in the early modern period, including, for example, the Reusner family of printers who worked in Königsberg from 1640 to 742. Johann Heinrich Hartung bought this printing press in 1741. The Hartungsche Verlagsdruckerei then remained active until the time of the Second World War. Another family name, which has also been associated with the printing industry since the Renaissance, survives much longer. The name Elsevier, whose progenitor was a Calvinist religious refugee Louis Elsevier in Leiden in 1583. Family members kept the company on course until 1712. In 1880, the Dutch bookseller Jacobus George Robbers re-established the Elsevier Publishing House in Rotterdam, and since 1887, the company has been based in Amsterdam as a global scientific publisher. The more frequent case, which occurred in many places, was not the formation of a dynasty, but the handing over of the printing equipment into new hands. Very few printers made a fortune, many could not find hires. Or the widow married a journeyman in order to keep the painting house in her possession. Short-lived existences of a few years or most of few decades were the rule in Europe in the Renaissance period when princes, cities, universities, and dioceses everywhere wanted to have their own printers. Some printers connected the fate of their printing business with the writings of a great scholar. Erasmus von Rotterdam worked together with Johann Froben from 1514 and with his Hyers. Martin Luther, on the other hand, first cooperated with the Leipzig printer and publisher Michael Lotter, but resigned after a scandal involving Lotter's son and switched to Hans Luft. In the case of the Finnish Lutheran reformer Mikael Agricola, who constantly translated basic theological texts into Finnish, the names of the printers have long been forgotten. So it can be summed up that in the history of book printing, the European Renaissance, it is possible to characterize very different types of printers. As it is always the case in any typology, the divisions are not always absolutely distinct, rather they are fluid transitions between individual aspects. First aspect, there's a scholarly type who has studied the septem artis liberalis and who promoted ancient literature as a humanist. Second type, there's a translator who also has an academic humanistic background but works for the implementation of the national languages for various reasons. And there's a third type, the tradesman, who carries out orders for money and according to the wishes of his authors. This type is undoubtedly the dominant one. Its share is increasing in the 17th and 18th century. Each of these three types of printers can also fulfill other aspects. They can live in poverty or start a successful business. This can change hand after his death or be continued into entire printer dynasties. And the trade can lead to various forms of specialization, also by privileges, which in turn characterize the technical equipment of a printing workshop. For example, special types, music engraving, cartography. In the context of our conference topic, there's another role that book printers played in the Renaissance and Reformation area. Benedict Anderson's famous thesis about should be recalled, according to which printers exerted a decisive influence on the invention of the nation because they produced prints in all living languages used by a nation or an ethnic group. This activity is based on the humanistic conviction of the plurality and at the same time equality of national languages. In the Protestant area, this development was favored by the commitment to the vernacular, to the language of the people. But this commitment also applies to the church, which is often completely overlooked from a Western European research perspective, and in this respect also differed from the Roman Catholic Church, and I mean the Slavic Orthodoxy. The beginning of Church Slavonic book printing in Cyrillic letters was Schweibert Fiol, who came from Franconia in the south of Germany and was a goldsmith by trade. Fiol opened a printing workshop in Krakow in 1489. In 1491, he printed the Octoich, an Orthodox liturgical book. In the same year, he was thrown into prison for high debts. What I mean with poverty. In 1492, he was banned from printing in Church Slavonic, and it was only after 1503 that he returned to printing in Cyrillic letters in Livocha, Hungary. What Fiol had started was continued 3 years later in Centini in Montenegro. There in 1494, the priest monk Macarie, who died after 1528, printed the first book in the Serbian language, a church hymn book. After the Turkish invasion, he fled to Wallachia, where he printed, perhaps in Targovište, the liturgical work Klushebnik in 1508, a second hymnal in 1510, and the Tetra Evangelium in 1512. Little is known about the life of Macarie. There was even a research discussion about whether the printers from 1495 and 1408 to 12 were identical. But in contrast to the craftsman Fiol, he had studied and can therefore be counted among the learned printers. His profession is also indicated in the afterword of the Tetra Evangelium, in which he reveals himself as a monk. Unlike Aldus Manutius, from whom, according to some researchers, Macarie had learned the art of printing, he tried to use the vernacular and wanted to use his books to provide basic text for Orthodox worship in Serbian language. This all finally brings me to the hero of this conference, Franciscus Skorina, also in German mentioned as SKORINA, who was born in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. SKORINA is in some respects a very special case among the printers of the European Renaissance. There are 4 points that I wanted to stress out. First, he had first studied in Krakow and held, like Manutius, a bachelor degree in fine arts, Septem Artes Liberalis. But what is unusual in SKORINA's life is his academic degree. And this is unusual in 2 ways. He received a doctorate, a PhD in Padua in 1512, and that was a doctorate of medicine. Second, SKORINA worked in his own printing workshop as a translator, where he, unlike William Caxton, concentrated exclusively on Bible text, which he translated into Old Belarusian or Ruthenian, the Church Slavonic version of both. And he published as editor and as printer at the same time. Here there are also parallels to Macarie, but also to other printers of the Renaissance, such as Jan Maletius, who, as a pastor and archpriest in East Prussian, translated and printed Paul's text for the church liturgy. In contrast to Macarie and SKORINA, Maletsky's production was not limited to just one language. In addition, in the course of the early modern period, one repeatedly encounters clergymen who ran their own printing workshop. SKORINA is also a special case from this point of historical view. Unlike Macarie, he was not a theologian. And unlike Maletsky and others, but like Macarie, he only printed in one language. Neither were reformers of the Una Sancta Ecclesia like Luther, Zwingli, or Agricola, but they were also concerned about the installation and cultivation of the vernacular in everyday church life. Third aspect. Thanks to his academic profession, SKORINA was always able to switch to another office if his job as a printer did not bring him enough money. While Macarie was caught by his congregation, SKORINA fared like Philo, who was able to work as a goldsmith. Among the book printers who appeared as scholars with a specialization in theology and as translators at the same time, there's not any successful entrepreneur like Koberger. The fact that one of these learned printer translators was able to hand over his office to a successor seemed also to be an exception, and among those mentioned in this presentation, it is only the case of Maletius, whose son continued his father's double work in Leek. At the end of 1519, beginning of 1520, SKORINA had to give up his Prague printing workshop, for which the plague contributed in addition to financial problems. He then became the personal physician of Bishop John of the Lithuanian Dukes in Vilnius. It is not clear why he did not produce any further work after his apostles were printed in Vilnius in 1525, but various legal proceedings seem to have occupied him until 1535. As is well known, he did not resume printing in Prague, his last station in life, but worked as a gardener and laid out the botanical garden. SKORINA's journey through life also ended exceptionally. He did not resume printing anymore. The fourth and last point, and then I'm ready with my short presentation. The activity as a printer, which took up less than a decade of his wandering life between Greater Lithuania and the Bohemian royal city, can be characterized as a kind of project. The planned execution of the translations and their prints clearly follows a concept, a plan, a concept. SKORINA was early aware of his achievement and at the same time of the importance of his project. He was also convinced of the high reputation and of the importance of a printer, and, like Luther, saw it as his task to write religious books in the language of the people. Until then, and for many decades to come, it was exceptional for a printer to illustrate a book he had produced with his own portrait. Doing this, SKORINA emphasized in a very special way the obligation of the new media technique for the society. That this portrait is printed in a book of Holy Scripture elevates a printer even above the theologian. It's a remarkable statement from the Renaissance days of book printing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. It's time for Benito, if he will join us. We haven't Benito now in this time. Discussions time for us. Do you have questions in chat? We haven't questions in public. If our guests, our conference, just have a question. If you Professor, we have one question. Justina Kilchantik-Ziemba have one question. Walter, you see in chat. It's not really a question. This comment.
Yeah, I have a question. I think it is quite unusual for German scholars to include Cyrillic printing in their research on European book culture. What new insights can researchers get from this, or what new insights did you get from including SKORINA, Macari, and so on, in one, list with Manutius, Frobenius, and so on?
The idea is the following. There are a lot of publications about printers, especially of the Renaissance, and what is missing, in my opinion, is some kind of analytical tool that these printers, it's a new business, and these craftsmen doing that, they have to find their ways that these printers, let's say, try different ways to find successful ways of this new art. And the idea is very easy. As far as I can overview the printing history in Europe, SKORINA really is in some cases an exception, or a very special type of printer. He is a learned one, and that is very important. You know, learned printers are the number of learned printers is reduced during the centuries when printing became more and more, not an art, but a kind of business. And people like Manutius, you cannot find a lot of them in later centuries. Elsevier, for example, and Koberger, they were businessmen. And SKORINA was really one person who is an outsider. He's an outsider. Others have been outsiders too. He's an outsider, but in different or in some ways, he is no theologian for translating and publishing theological books. He is a doctor of medicine. He was working as a physician for some dukes, also for a very short period for Duke Albrecht of Brandenburg in Eastern Prussia. And so the idea is just to characterize and to emphasize the work, the production of, or the work and the life of Skorina in the history of printing as some exceptional way, in some ways. For me, it's really, I'm not sure if there are other cases in the Renaissance, but as far as I know, not, that a printer is really printing his own picture inside a book, and especially a theological book. And that is, in my opinion, a very important statement for or about the role, the role in society of the new art, or for the new art. I hope that answers your question a bit.
Thank you for the answer, Professor Walter. And I saw that this Benito Real Costas is online, and he is me to ask for this presentation. Associate Professor Dr. Benito Real Costas is from the Complutense University of Madrid, Spain, and this presentation will be about the printing revolutions, systems, expectations, and structures. Please, Benito, we will listen to you.
Okay, thank you for your kind introduction. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of Francis Skorina and the Renaissance Book Culture for inviting me to participate in this conference. It is a pleasure to be at Vilnius University, despite virtually, and to share my work with you. Although historians have always listed printing as one of the most remarkable cultural and technological achievements in modern human history and highlighted its impact on the modern world, little has been said and written about how printing and print culture became a complex system and structure. In previous lectures and works, I have already highlighted the various conceptualizations of technology and 15th century printing, and suggested how to conceptualize the differences between medieval written culture and Renaissance print culture. This paper's main line of argument parallels and complements those lectures and works. The printing revolutions, systems, expectations, and structures aims to be a step forward in our understanding of the so-called printing revolution by developing the theme of technological and social systems and structures. In this paper, I will suggest what the so-called printing revolution was. Contemporary scholars continue to debate how technology ought to be defined and how its boundaries ought to be delineated. Emphasis has been placed on a variety of phenomena and concepts. Some of these approaches have influenced the history of 15th century printing scholarship more than others. Book historians strongly favor the supposedly revolutionary nature of the invention of the printing press and its role in progress. The printing press is a shorthand phrase often used to suggest the upheaval of a new cultural era brought by Gutenberg, and a kind of unidirectional, progressive, and technological deterministic development. Some of these ideas have attracted some criticism from different directions, but they are still used as a starting point in many new studies. Recent scholarship on the printing revolution is still shaped by the identification of machines and technology and by the concepts of invention and progress. In that scholarship, the printing press means technology, and its invention means progress. The premises needed to sustain such argumentation came under criticism on a variety of fronts, but the history of the printing revolution continues to be conducted along the lines of machines and progress. Regarding machines, it is necessary that three things be distinguished. These three things are machines, the knowledge involved in their use, and their social impacts and interactions. Contrary to what book historians seem to assume, technological change does not reside in machines, nor in the knowledge to invent and use them. Technological change is not about the invention of new machines, nor their use by single humans. Machines remain machines, and their use remain a technique if they are separated from society. Only if machines are used, if using them creates new experiences and they have an impact on the structure of a society, and if that impact and experiences involve a change in social meanings and knowledge, can we speak of technological change? Technological change resides in a hybrid system of forces and interactions. Although contemporary book historians keep repeating the revolutionary role of the printing press in human progress, other scholars continue to debate how progress ought to be defined and how its many aspects are related. The Enlightenment was the starting point of the modern idea of progress. The Enlightenment highlighted the rational nature of humans and the rational character of the historical process. Enlightenment was reason, and reason was progress toward a perfection. The Darwinian theory of evolution seemed to foster and complement the dominant belief in progress, and often evolution was misleadingly equated with progress. Evolution was popularized as a kind of orderly change. Nature and history were often perceived as a constant process of advancing toward a more complex and more perfect form. The inference was easily made to the conclusion that progress was cumulative. In the 20th century, the concept of unilinear, harmonic, and automatic progress was subjected to criticism, but the main principles and criteria of cumulative progress were not in dispute. Progress remained conceived by many as the development of knowledge, and human history was interpreted as demonstrating that. Today, the idea of cumulative knowledge and technological progress retains its vitality among book historians. There is the conviction that progress is a law of nature which ensures that experience and knowledge become increasingly complex. It is believed that progress is the passage from a simpler to a more complex system or structure of experiences and meanings, and every stage of development, passing from the simplest to the most complex, assimilate, integrate, and encompass all previous ones. The present throws light on the past, and complex systems have the key to understanding more simple ones. To some extent, one generation's experiences, knowledge, and meanings are transmitted through the hereditary structure to the next. The so-called printing revolution has been presented as part of these supposedly maturative stages. Historians have highlighted its positive outcomes and impact and studied it as a step of this evolutive and maturative process. There is the conviction that printing encompassed and overcame the manuscript world. The printing press converted a simpler system of knowledge into a more complex one. It is believed that knowledge is more developed because it serves not only to explain new experiences, but also to understand and explain meanings and phenomena experienced in previous systems or earlier stages of progress. However, In countering this line of thinking, it needs to be stressed that societies are structures or systems open to alteration, that technology is part of them, and that meanings and knowledge consist of association of elements in that system. Societies are systems in transformation and not a mere accumulation of elements and their properties. A system, on this account, is defined as a set of elements, each of which has its own particular meanings defined by its relations to other elements in that system. Meanings are only differences or distinctions, and they change when we use them at different times and in different structures. Knowledge and meanings are social mental structures and concern whole schemas rather than the properties of the individual elements themselves. Meanings and knowledge are conditioned and defined by the alterations among these elements, but elements and relations change, and therefore so does their meanings. Knowledge and meanings are relational rather than substantial. The structure of systems is not stable. It is contingent, and the connective value of their elements always change. With the attainment of a new state, the structure or schema of the prior state is no longer recognizable, since the interconnections between the different elements of that system become different. Changes in societies must be considered as different structures or systems linked with precedent ones, but following different organizing principles. When societies move to a new structure, they still can approach some characteristic tasks of previous structures, since machines, objects, and records are partially and misleadingly transmitted to the next one. But their meanings have completely changed, as have changed their set of relations within the structure. The so-called printing revolution involved the systemization of new experiences into mental structures derived from the use of new machines. Change and not progress concerns one broad aspect of the wholeness of structures or systems and their elements. The number of elements is not steady, nor does it necessarily increase, and the established relations among them are not always kept active. The printing revolution did not result from the attainment of greater structural complexity and more complex meanings and knowledge through more complex structures. Change is not a recursive progression of phases within a developmental process. Changes consist of structures or systems that adjust to new situations and unknown experiences. Unknown experiences as disruptive because they change the balance of world systems. Systems and their interconnections change as a means to avoid conflict and reestablish harmony, congruence and consonance between experience, knowledge, and meanings. New elements and interrelations result in new meanings or knowledge. A state, print culture, is just a particular schema, and the relations and meanings of knowledge of previous schemas have been lost forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Benito, for our presentation. Do we have questions from our chat? Chat. No, this time we haven't questions from our guest from our hall. Also, we haven't questions. How, Benito, you see the Eastern Europe situation in printing progress, because we very deep in east from the main sites, main centers of printing. How Benitez, if you want, if you could answer the question, Eastern Europe and the revolution of the printing.
Excuse me, can you repeat your question, please?
Eastern Europe and the revolution of printing. How you saw this progress in this region? Is this specific something or not the same like in Spain, or difference is?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's different. The structures that and the meanings that different places, different geographic places, established in that schema, in that structure. I mean, I have in the past I have written some works on peripheries and centers, because normally, as far as I know, normally we apply the same schemas to, or the same structures of meanings and knowledge to the peripheries. But I am convinced that the peripheries, they had their own structures, they established their own connections, because they perceived and they understood printing and the so-called printer revolution in a different way, depending on the geographic area.
Thank you, Benitez. There's, if well, have questions from our. Oh, one question. Please.
Okay, Benito, I would like to ask, I don't know if it's possible to answer shortly to this, but could you comment shortly how communication could be included in this perspective and shift of modes of communication?
It is not easy to understand, to explain or to answer to your question. Can you please tell me what you understand by communication? What do you mean with communication?
Well, communication of ideas, which can, of course, be identified as exchange of knowledge, but knowledge is something strikingly, it's different than just ideas. But I was thinking about including into this idea of printing revolution the more anthropological, let's say, perspective of different orders of communication, like oral, written, then printing press, and its revolution or evolution, and then maybe digital.
Well, if I understand correctly your question, the transfer of knowledge and the transfer of ideas are part of this structure, of this social structure. Normally, when the society moves from one structure to another structure, there is a time of convulsion, I mean, the society is in some way lost, and they apply their knowledge, their experiences to a new situation. And I think that 15th century printing is a clear example of this. I mean, how in some way, the manuscript word and the manuscript experience was applied, or the manuscript knowledge was applied to the printing press. I mean, the printing press was invented to solve different problems that the manuscript word had. I mean, nobody could foresee the consequences, the real consequences, the printing, the application, the use of the printing press had.
answer was good or not for this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Benito.
Thank you, Benito, for your answer. Dear colleagues, our section second is continued. It's called the development of printing in Europe. And first, our presentation will be Professor Dr. Zoran Mladic from University of Osijek, Croatia. He's a book historian, our friend from Croatia. And we have Zoran.
It's fine. Okay. So as we have only 20 minutes, I'll start immediately. First of all, I would like to really express my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to this conference. And I would also like to express a little bit of nostalgia, as if I remember well, exactly 5 years ago, we were sitting in this same room with our colleagues speaking about the book covers, and it was really a perfect experience. But okay, it's fine also to be present in this way. So once more, thanks a lot for invitations. So today, basic things about the origins and context of print in Croatia, because I think it's peculiar enough in European context, but it also shares some international development factors which are worthy to explain. So my aims are just to share some basic things about the origins and early context of Croatian printing. And then the main part of my expose would be to explain these indigenous and international factors, which in fact explain how the print in Croatia came into being. And then, of course, following that two aims, also to outline other main currents regarding centers of influence, genres, scripts that were used, and similar. So, what I would like to emphasize at the very beginning in this map, which is shown here, and this red dot, which in fact marks the peninsula of Istria. I guess you are all acquainted with Croatia as much that you know that today this is a famous touristic destination with the city of Opatija, Pula, Rovinj, and so on. So why there? Because of two most important reasons. The first one, that the medieval manuscript tradition of glagolitic letters was extremely developed there. And the second one was that Italy was very, very close. And this closeness of Italy, particularly the city of Venice, was geographically a positive factor for the development of Croatian print. And I'll say at the very beginning that, in fact, the fate of printing in Croatia was the fate of geography. Later on, during my talk, you will immediately realize that this good transit geographic position steered up at the beginning of printing at the end in the second half of the 15th century, but in the very same way during the 16th century, and due to the Ottoman riots, it stopped completely for century and a half. So, as I told, in this space, which is the space of the Eastern Adriatic, we note two parallel traditions. One tradition would be international, and as I told, the closeness of Italy, the commerce with Italy, particularly with Venice, exposed this territory to all the influences which could come from there, and also this closeness brought the Latin heritage very quickly, and not that just that it brought the Latin heritage, but due to the other historical factors, Croatia was really the country that developed at the territory of former Roman Empire, and this Latin heritage and tradition was deeply interwoven with its development. But also there was a very developed glagolitic tradition which started to develop during the developed Middle Ages. And during the 15th century, glagolitic letters, I think that I don't have to say a lot about glagolitics. It's a well-known fact, so it's a very special form of writing developed exclusively for Slavic languages and having graphemes, which could express phonemes, which Latin script didn't have at this time. So it was also developed in both private correspondence and public texts. And beginning in the 13th century, some glagolitic manuscripts appeared. And those involved in writing these glagolitic manuscripts, mistals and breviaries typically, were later on to become first individuals involved in printing, which will be explained quickly. And also to make situation just a little bit more complicated, there was strict script coming from central Bosnia, which was also used in the southern part of East Adriatic, so in the region from the cities of Split and Makarska till Dubrovnik. And this script was resembled very much of Cyrillic, and it is a form of Cyrillic letter, but developed under the influence of Latin and glagolitic script. So it had some different characters, and it was known as a Western type of Cyrillic or Croatian form of Cyrillic, or also as Bosančica, due to the fact that it was used both in Bosnia and Croatia. So what I want to emphasize again at the very beginning, and that will help to understand all about the Croatian printing later on, are two dominant currents. Which one? The first one that was marked by switching to the international processes, where the early Croatian printers in fact learned and participate in Italian printing, and the other one which was indigenous and which resulted with the first projects of printing in vernacular in the 80s. So the host asked you to start video. Okay, if I start my video, is it okay? Everything's okay?
Yeah, we saw you.
Okay, I can continue. Okay, to say a few words more about international stratum is in fact that 70% of Croatian incunabula were printed in Italian workshops, and half of them was printed in Venice. The first one was printed in Rome in 1474. So 3/4 of all Croatian book production during the 15th century was connected to Venice itself. And which is also interesting for understanding all this situation was that every person from Croatian territories who wanted to learn something about either printing or book binding or book selling was supposed to proceed to Italy. So the first Croatian printers like Andrea Paltačić and Boninus de Boninis, so Dobrić Dobričević, or the good one, which was good to translate it in English, they all learned their craft in Venice, and later on they continued careers either in Italy or in or in France. Getting back to native stratum, we all conclude that, in fact, the knowledge that early Croatian printers gained in Italian workshop resulted in their attempts and, in fact, their first endeavors in making typographies and printing the books in glagolitic print. So the first one is the missal according to Roman law, or the Roman missal, which was printed in 1483. We know exact from colophons. We know exact year, but unfortunately, the place of printing was not mentioned. So we don't know where this one is printed. We can boast, of course, that this is the first European missal which is not printed in Latin script and not printed in Latin language. So it was printed in Croatian language of the early in Croatian language of the medieval ages and glagolitic script. But unfortunately, as I told, we don't know where was it printed. All guesses would point to Venice, of course. Then again, the breviary, which is printed in 1491, and one instructions for professors, which are printed in 1492. All these books witness about the well-developed glagolitic printing at the end of the 15th century. The most important for understanding of any further development was a breviary, which was produced in 1493 in the print shop of Andrea Torresani. The famous Torresani, who also employed Aldus Manutius and some other famous book people from the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century. There was a Croatian priest and entrepreneur, I would say, named Blaž Baromić, who worked there, who was engaged as a proofreader in this missal. We also know it because it was explicitly stated in colophon. And we also know that this Blaž Baromić 30 years ago produced a handwritten breviary, which we call Mavrov breviary, and it is attributed to him. He was given as the scribe in this breviary. So that's a sort of ultimate proof when we speak that the medieval glagolitic scribal circles transferred, let's say, themselves into the first Croatian printers. We conclude that the Baromić was the representative of these circles who was engaged not just in proofreading of this breviary, but who also learned business of print while he was in Venice in Torresani bookshop. And this is why at the very beginning we can put this map and point at Istria and the regions of Istria as the main centers of the beginning of Croatian printer. So as I just told, not just that he worked as a proofreader, Baromić obviously mastered the art of printing in Torresani print shop. So it was 1943. A year later, I apologize, 1493. A year later, in 1494, Baromić returned to the Eastern Adriatic, so to the Croatia, and then in the city of Senj, which is northeast Adriatic, he opened the first print shop which we have in Croatia, and in 1494 he printed glagolitic missal in Senj, and that was the first incunabulum which was incunabula, which was for certain printed in Croatia. Some of our scientists argue that the first missal mentioned in this presentation one printed in 1483 was also printed in Croatia, but I wouldn't agree. I think we don't have enough proofs for such claim. So the printing of this missal is marked in very, very diversified ways in Croatia. I put here on the presentation the coin of 5 kunas, which was anniversary coin, and which also boosts of this event. In this printing press in Senj, 7 books were printed from 1494 to 1508. And what is very, very interesting, we don't know for a single historical source which would say about buying the paper or setting the typesets or whatever which would say more about this printing press. So we only know from incipits and colophons where it is stated that these books were printed by Blaž Barović in Senj, that we can put it in time and space. So to say just a little bit more about the first Croatian books, and to show this announced diversification in scripts. Also, 1495, the first book in Croatian language and in Latin script was printed also in Venice. And then a little bit later, the same, so the Croatian language and Cyrillic script was applied in office with prayers to the Holy Virgin. So it is completely obvious that this native stratum was deeply involved in first print, and from this we can prove that the medieval Croatian heritage was really somehow transferred to printing tradition, and we can say that medieval scribes accepted the print techniques and used it for spreading the, of course, in this period, mostly the word of faith. So I would only like to mention for the end of this part of presentation that after the Senj, next Croatian print shop was opened in the city of Rijeka in 1530, again by Bishop Šimon Kožičić-Benja. There they printed 6 glagolitic books, small catechism, also some ABC book, 1 book of historical nature. After this, 1530, no print press existed in Croatia until the beginning of the 18th century, as I told, because of the Ottoman rights. So, to sum up this part of presentation, and in fact to say the 6 most important characteristics of early Croatian print. As I told, dominant lines of developments can be divided in international participation. I hope that I managed to show this deep influence of Venice as important geographical print center on Croatian printing, but also indigenous efforts of another meaning that medieval tradition was transferred into print. To continue with this international line, extremely important was vicinity of Venice, where first Croatian book people and printers acquired the practical knowledge. Regarding native or indigenous line of development, the very important fact is that medieval scribes accepted the new technology of produced books, and with all their experience, in fact, they became the generators of Croatian printing. Also, which could be seen as peculiar, that the inheritance of medieval pluralism in the use of writing system was transmitted from manuscript to printed culture. So all the 3 scripts used as in manuscript book productions continued to be used in print book production, And then the fact that the initial domination, that at the beginning Glagolitic script dominated, later on the Latin script prevailed, and of course I think which is a conclusion for all the early prints all around Europe, domination of religious writing at the beginning. So as I told, after these initial periods, we have a period of stagnation, and we can, as a game of destiny, in 1493, when Barović proofreaded the breviary in Venice, there was a famous battle of Krbovsko Polje, where the defense strength of Croatian, Hungarian army was broken, and after that Croatia was really for more than 150 years exposed to constant raids and attacks, and the war was never a period where when the print in early modern period when the print would flourish. And then later on, even after the peace of Sremske Karlovci in 1683, the Croatian space was divided between Venetian Republic and Austro-Hungarian part, which was also not positive fact for printing. In this period, just to sum up briefly what is placed on this slide, not almost, but all the Croatian books were printed abroad. As a rule, all the books from the northern Croatia were printed either in Austrian centers, mostly in Graz and Vienna, and later on, from the beginning of 18th century, more and more in Hungary, in Pest, Buda, and so on. And all the books which were written by authors from Dalmatia, the south part, would be printed, of course, in Italy, and still mostly in Venice. After the all historical circumstances settled down and the periods of peace prolonged, so after the beginning of the 18th century, printing shops were opened in different cities, first in the northern Croatia, Zagreb, and the city of Osijek, and only after that period we can speak about continuous the development of printing in Croatia. So to say something about the numbers, how was it looked? We have 10 incunabulas printed in Croatian language, 6 in Glagolitic. We have 2 incunabulas printed in Croatia in the print press of Senj. Approximately 45 incunabulas were somehow connected with individuals originated in Croatia. Either they were writers or they were printers. Then later, perhaps to mention this long period of stagnation, which is very important for us, because you see, we speak about vigorous development at the beginning. At the end of the 15th century, beginnings of the 16th century, the print flourished, and then really due to the geographical positions and historical facts, it stagnated for a long period. It's awakened, let's say so, in the 18th century with some 340 books printed there, and at the end, so approximate number of books printed in Croatian is stated, which is compared to the beginnings very small number. What is also, I think, an interesting fact, and I'd like to conclude with this one, although, of course, Latin script predominated during the early modern and modern era, Glagolitic and Cyrillic are still used. So the basic facts are written here. You'll notice that they are mostly connected with the religion and with the organizations which and the faiths. which in fact attempted to use, of course, every possible language that would be and script that would be understandable for the believers, and perhaps the unique fact, of course, there was a missal composed in the Roman Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in Glagolitic and in Croatian. A priest, the second name of the priest who helped and who composed and proofread this missal was Frane Parčić. So the missal is named Parčić missal. The first edition was printed in 1893, and the last edition was printed at the very beginning of the 28th century in 1905. So if we speak about the sort of tradition of printing missals in Glagolitic in Croatia, we have almost 5 centuries. So I'm not going to close the presentation in case that there will be some questions. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize if I speak a little bit longer than I was permitted. So okay, that was it.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. And I'm very glad to invite our colleague from Estonia, from Academic Library of the Tallinn University, Dr. Tiiu Reimo. Glad to see you. And this your please.
Dear colleagues, more than a year ago, when I proposed this topic to the conference, I couldn't imagine that these phenomena I prepared to talk about will be so actual today, more than 5 centuries later. War, death, shortages of food and water, robbery and plunder, nearby in Ukraine. The aim of my presentation is to introduce the popular printed media for spreading news starting from the end of the 15th up to the beginning of the 18th centuries, and to demonstrate this new media through the tragic famine in Livonia in the years 1601 up to 1603. Famine at the beginning of the 17th century was caused by the natural catastrophe. The Huayna-Putina volcano eruption in South Peru in February 1600 had a significant impact on Earth's climate, causing severe decrease of temperatures in Northern Hemisphere, including East and North Europe. Intimately intertwined with the fortunes of the war waged in the area by the crowns of Sweden and Poland, news on bad harvest and shortage of food were documented in both official and semi-official reports recorded in the written histories of the time, and as individual experiences in personal diaries, as well as disseminated in print in the form of pamphlets or newsletters. The presentation focuses on the description and characterization of the depictions of the famine and does not aim to investigate the historical truth of the events on the basis of documentary evidence. In the German-speaking world, the hugely popular early printed newsletters published since the late 15th century until the advent of true periodicals were known by a number of different titles: Flugblatt, Flugschrift, Zeitung, Neue Zeitung. These infrequently appearing pamphlets helped to facilitate the information flow in Europe. Owing to their short format, just a couple of pages, they could be reprinted quickly, which explained the existence of multiple editions of the same text, printed in different language dialects, for example in Low and High German, and in different cities. Although coming in different sizes and formats, The contents of newsletters remain much the same, presenting one or several reports on relatively recent events, either in prose or poetry. Aside from wars, the readers also welcomed news on other topics of public interest, such as various acts of crime and witchcraft, the terrifying and extraordinary spectacles of nature, including comets, halos, meteorites, lunar and solar eclipses. To catch the attention of the reader, the headlines were peppered with sensation-stirring adjectives, such as truthful, horrible, detailed, miserable, unheard of. The actual veracity of such newsletter stories was in general never a concern. It was precisely their scandalous, wondrous, or fantastical content that was expected to draw the greatest appreciation from the audience. Existing copies rarely mention authors, place of publication, or the name of the printer. The publication date may also be left vague. Thus, any claims to historical truth on these pages should never be fully trusted, but at the same time, they do not belong to the realm of pure fantasy either. The newsletters reporting on the famine in Livonia, 11 are currently known to exist in German languages and 2 in English. Yet the actual number of source texts which they are based on amounts only to 4. In terms of their geographic setting, the events described in the newsletters take place in Pärnu, Tartu, and on the island of Saaremaa, Ösel. The story from nowadays Latvia takes us to the provinces of Semigallia and Samogitia, then incorporated into the Duchy of Courland. The headline, "Horrible yet true accounts of misery and sorrow brought upon Livonia by waging of wars and unheard death, so much that the child will kill and eat its parents. Parents will kill and eat their child. A friend is turned against friend, a spouse against spouse, a neighbor against neighbor, all murdering and devouring their children and themselves as well," is known from 2 newsletters. The title page of the first newsletter gives Gdansk, as its place of first publication, and is dated as 15th of April, but no the time of the publication. The place of publication of the second newsletter is not known, but its title page provides us with a number of a year, 1602. The second newsletter also includes an additional story which recounts the events of the recent battle near the city of Tauris nowadays, where the Safavid army of Abbas I of Persia had scored an important victory over the Ottomans. The text regarding events in Livonia is the same in both newsletters. It comprises 2 letters allegedly addressed to Konrad Schlüsselburg, superintendent of Stralsund. The author of the first letter, lamenting the sorry state of Livonia, is indicated as Johann Plato, the Hauptmann of the city garrison of Pärnu, in the service of Prince Karl, Duke of Södermanland, the future King Charles IX of Sweden. The letter from Pärnu is dated as 4th of May, 1602. Compare it with a date given on the title page, but includes nothing directly associated with Pärnu. There is a quite general description of how people have suffered from the war, plunder, and famine. It says that thousands of people, Germans, Swedes, Polacks, and not Germans, that is Estonians and Latvians and Livonians, have been killed. It is written, there has been a rapid growth of living costs and shortage of food, especially among peasants, so that many people had to eat dead animals like horses, dogs, and cats, and also that many people had eaten one another. To specify what is an unheard story, that near Salis, 2 girls have eaten their own dead father, and that also a widow, when his husband died, ate him. In another place, a neighbor has sent a child towards another man to fetch something. The other man seized the child, cut his throat, and in the moment when he was removing the entrail, came the father of the child, worried of child's long absence, and became very angry. The other man slaughtered also the father, boiled his flesh, and ate it. The second letter ascribes its authorship to certain Franz Kappen and contains a report on the famine that had struck the island of Saaremaa. It is dated in the print as the 32nd of February, 1602. As the previous one, nothing in it is directly associated to Saaremaa, unless the fact that in these news there is nothing about the war. Saaremaa belonged to the Danish crown at that time. It is written, not only that the poor people, spent and hungry, fell on the ground and died while on the way to the others, but that poor people, when they see or find a dead cow, crimmage around the carrion, and do not see how unnatural it is to quarrel about a dead pig, dog, or cat, but that also parents eat their dead children. However, the author explains the reasons of the famine. When we wanted to buy the grain for a doubled sum of money, we couldn't get it because grain was left under the snow, as it could not ripen because of the cold summer, so that I couldn't help my subordinates who had to leave them to die of hunger. The same 2 letters, accompanied with an account of the battle between Safavid and Ottoman armies, were subsequently published in the Messrelations, trade fair reports that were immensely popular in the early 17th century Germany. The proper names and place names which appear in the letters have taken a slightly different form compared to these 2 originals. As English translation of the original German text, these very same 2 letters ended up before the British audience, published in 1603 by 2 different publishers in London as a collection of 3 newsletters known by the headline on its first title page, a true report of 3 strange and wonderful accidents lately happened at Pärnu, a city in Livland, wherein is contained a prophecy of the great death and famine which by reason of the wars in those parts had come to pass in the year last past, 1602. In truth, the wonderful accidents at Pärnu bear no relation to the newsletters describing the famine and cannibalism. In line with the popular trend of the age to report and interpret any strange phenomena as signs and portents preceding a calamity, the newsletter highlights accidents which were compared to the harbingers of Jerusalem's doom, foreboding the God's anger and punishment which the people deserve for having led a life of sin. The Schlüsselburg letters are presented in the booklet with separate title page, which claim the accounts presented therein to be the true translation of the respective High German version, published in 1602 in Hamburg. News from Tartu. are the subject of two pamphlets from Germany, one printed in Magdeburg, the other in Schmalkalden. The description of the events is dated to the 2nd of August 1602. The author is not mentioned. The letters were addressed to an anonymous scholar from Livonia, then living in Berlin, to whom the letter is said to have reached on the 12th of September. The report deals with the Polish conquest of Viljandi in 1602 and with the Swedish conquest of Tartu, 1601, in the wrong temporal order, and in addition describes rampant famine in the surrounding area. It is written, unfortunately, is the famine in the country so big, especially among the Kurlanders and Estonians who live around Riga, Tartu, Pärnu, Alūksne and Viljandi, that they, horrible to say, slaughter and eat each other. Not far from Salis have parents eaten their own child, as well as two girls their own father. Local barbarians have, like dogs and ravens, flied on the dead bodies of the soldiers of Gockenhusen battlefield to still their hunger. There are no horses, dogs and other animals left. The towns and settlements like Võnnu, Valmiera, Limbaži, Rõngu, Karksi, Trikata and others are plundered, so that only wild animals live there. The famine in the Latvian territories is the subject of the newsletter entitled True, Quite Horrible, and since time began unheard news. Its author is named as Pastor Friedrich Engelke of Sikele in the Daugavpils area, or the Dünaburg area. The first print of this newsletter is deemed to be the 1603 issue of Königsberg. 3 additional prints are known to exist, one of them produced in the same year by the printing press of Christoph Lochner in Nuremberg. The remaining 2 have no indication of the place of publication. All consist of the preface on the Leser, and the author reproaches Livonia's for godless life, excessive luxury and arrogance, which has caused the rage of God. First, with a war, as soldiers came everywhere and robbed the poor people. Then with hoarfrost and severe cold that fall on the 5th day after St. Lawrence's Day in August 1601, when all summer grain was frozen and destroyed. The winter-rye was not very good, and what was left was taken by the soldiers and robbers. Nothing was left in the gardens, which grounded the great famine. The 28 counts of cannibalism, which the newsletter refers to, were based, according to the author, on the information he was able to gather from the court documents of Grobina, at that time Seleburg and Daugavpils, Dünaburg areas, some of which he had seen with his own eyes, and from the stories he had been told by the few remaining local pastors, noblemen, and other honest souls. The counts of cannibalism in different issues can have differences in order or wording, and all the pamphlets end with admonition. The famine in Livonia has also reached the form of a song. Versified newsletters were also very popular in the time of Reformation and religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. The text was rhymed and ought to be sung on the melody of well-known folk or religious song. The mentioned song was a part of the pamphlet 2 newsletters. Its place in Europe printing is not known. The title page announced the first edition once again in Gdansk. The first song tells a story which happened in Silesia in July 1602, when 3 people died after drinking the poisoned water. The second song is about the siege of Riga by Duke Karl and the Great Famine in Riga. Concluding, war, famine, and reports of cannibalism were excellent materials to provoke interest of wider audience in the form of newsletters. The extraordinarity was emphasized also in the titles. All pamphlets were to tell about truthful, horrible, unheard, and miserable events. The place of printing and the name of the printer remained in many cases unknown. The contents include similar examples, prominently featuring scenes of people devouring dead animal flesh or carrion. Depictions of cannibalism are general. Specific locations and names are mentioned only by one author, Past Engelken. Horrible stories foretelling the calamity to come admonished people to confess their sins and to pray to God for mercy. Thank you.
In our days, we call that bad news. We have, if we want one question, because time for the exhibition and we want to run there. If one small question is?
Printed in the German-speaking area. Also Riga was German-speaking, but it belonged at that time to the Polish crown, and perhaps therefore they were not printed there. But I do not know any such, in such form of newsletters from Stockholm, because Estonian duchy belonged to the Swedish crown. But there are several, we may call them newsletters or booklets during that war and famine were printed, but not in that same horrible way.
Information for exhibition. We invite you to exhibition. Will be in Wróblewski Library. Franciscan Little Travels Books, 500 years. It will be, like I said, in the Wróblewski Library of the Lithuanian Academy of Science, 1 Žygimanto Street. If you wait in this place, we will bring you to this place where will be exhibition opening. And also for participants after exhibition, we will have a dinner in the same place where was the lunch. It's information was in your bags also. Thanks.